In this video, we will talk about the impact of tax on the burden borne by buyers and by sellers. The key point here is that when you impose a tax, it does not matter what side of the market the tax is imposed. It could be a tax on sellers, it could be a tax on buyers. The reality is that both buyers and sellers will share in the burden of the tax. In other words, after the tax, buyers will be paying more than what they were paying before, and sellers may be receiving less than what they were receiving before. And this shared burden, or the relative shares of the burden of the tax, really depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. Let's illustrate that with this example. So here we have two panels. Panel A is where we have the demand curve being fairly inelastic. It's a very steep demand curve, and the supply curve is fairly elastic. So what that means is that the buyers are much less able to respond to a change in price than the sellers are. So if we impose a tax of PT, or T is our extent of tax, now before the tax, both buyers and sellers were receiving and paying P naught. With the tax, buyers now pay PB. So this is the difference between the price that buyers were paying before tax and the price buyers pay after tax. This is the burden of tax on the buyers. On the other hand, sellers are now receiving PS, which is less than what they were receiving before. The burden on the sellers is what they were receiving before tax and what they receive after tax. So in this case, because the demand curve is highly inelastic, buyers are sharing on more of the burden on the tax. In panel B, we have the opposite case, where the demand curve is fairly elastic, supply curve is steep, fairly inelastic. So in this case, if we impose the same tax, what we see is that now sellers who were receiving P naught before the tax are now receiving only PS. So there's a sharp drop in the price they're receiving after tax. Buyers who were paying P naught are now just paying PB. So the buyers share in the smaller burden of the tax. We can capture this idea with this nice little equation, which is the pass-through percentage of the extent of tax that is passed on to the buyers. And it's given by the ratio of the elasticity of supply and the difference between the elasticity of supply and demand. So let's, in the extreme case, if supply is highly or infinitely inelastic, we would say that the supply curve is zero. So this is the case when sellers cannot at all respond to a change in price. If that is the case, then the pass-through burden is basically 0 over minus ED, which is 0. So in this case, there's no tax which gets passed on to the buyers. Sellers bear the entire burden of the tax. On the other hand, if elasticity of demand is highly inelastic, in fact, it's perfectly inelastic, so it is 0. If that is the case, then the pass-through burden is simply ES over ES, which is 1. So now when demand is perfectly inelastic, the entire burden of the tax gets passed on to the buyers, and sellers do not foot any of the tax. And then we can look at the relative ratios compared to the difference between elasticity of demand and supply. So let's work with an intermediary scenario where elasticity of demand is, let's say, -2, and elasticity of supply is 4. So we are making relatively both demand and supply are both elastic, but we are saying that the elasticity of demand is less than the elasticity of supply. So in this case, the pass-through burden is given by elasticity of supply, which is 4 divided by 4 minus 2, which is 4 over 6, or 2/3. So in this case, 2/3 of the tax will be passed on. If, on the other hand, we had elasticity of supply being less than elasticity of demand, we would have seen the opposite, where more of the tax would have been borne by the sellers and less of the tax would have been passed on to the buyers. Hope this clarifies the link between elasticity of demand and supply and the relative burden of tax between the buyers and the sellers.